Hey guys, it's Alex, and today we're going to be doing something super cool. We're going to be taking a picture of space. But right now it's noon and broad daylight, so we can't really do that. We got to wait for it to get dark out. But in the meantime, we can look at our camera and get our settings set up correctly so that when we go out and it's dark, we're ready to go and ready to take a photo. So let's look at the camera real quick and we'll get our settings dialed in. So here we have the camera. We're going to get ready for our photos tonight. This is the Sony a7 III. Your camera is likely going to be different, so I'm not even going to try to show you what this camera is exactly and what the settings are. But basically, no matter what camera you use, we want to be in manual mode, which is M there. So we'll switch it on so we can check our settings here. I like to pull out the screen so I can see it a little bit better. So we want to be in manual mode, and we want to have our aperture wide open. That's the f-stop number there, the one in orange. This lens only goes down to f4.0, I believe. I don't think it goes any lower. You want to get the lowest number possible on that, so we have our aperture wide open to let in all the light that we're going to need. And then we also want to turn ISO off or to 0. So right now it's set on auto. The lowest I can go on this camera is 50. So we're going to set it at that. So the camera is not going to artificially lighten up the image at all. We don't want that. We want the shutter to remain open so that we can get as much light in as possible when we're taking a photo of the night sky. And if you want a more detailed explanation about how the science works behind this, be sure to watch my video on how a camera works. But for now, we want our aperture wide open. We want our ISO as low as it'll possibly go. And then our shutter speed is what is going to be the factor in our photo. So we want it to be pretty darn low. I'm probably going to start off by taking it around 6 seconds or so, which is that number there down at the bottom left. And that basically means that the shutter is going to stay open for 6 seconds and let all that light in. Again, go watch the camera video about how a camera works. We can kind of get a preview on the screen of how much light is being let in. I'll probably leave it at that for now. I'll take some at that exposure, and then I'll adjust it to be even longer. That would be like a 30-second exposure, and so on. So those are the settings that we're going to use. I'm going to bring along my iPad and obviously my phone so that I can remotely connect, because we're going to need our camera. We're going to have to set it up on a tripod so it doesn't move at all. We don't want it moving and ruining our image. And then I'm going to bring some kind of a remote shutter device so that I can take the picture without actually touching the camera and bumping it like that. So those are our settings, and with that, we're going to pack our bag and get ready to go. All right, so just one last breakdown before we go. We want to make sure we have all our gear with us because we're going almost an hour away, and that would really be a bummer to find out we don't have everything when we got there. So I know it's going to be dark when I get there, so I want to do as much work ahead of time to save myself the trouble of having to fumble around in the dark and having to set everything up. So we know the camera settings are set where we want them, and I've also taken the little tripod mount out of the tripod and stuck it on the camera already, because that's just one more thing that's easier to do in the light. We've got the camera batteries charging. I have extra batteries in my bag. We have the tripod, we have the iPad for the remote shutter, and then within my bag I also have several different lenses that are going to be coming in handy, and I want to try out different lenses when we're out there. So we basically have everything we need, just those few things. With that, let's get going. All right, we made it. We're going to use the exact same camera settings that we just set before we left home, and we're going to see what kind of results we get. All right, so we're back home. It's actually the next day. I just went to bed when I got home, but basically I wanted to show you some of the settings and kind of rehash those before I get into the editing process, because I did a few of the settings wrong, and I figured that out when I was out there filming. So basically what happened was it was so dark that this 30-second exposure time was not long enough to pick up any kind of stars in the sky. So I'll show you what I got as an example. This was a 30-second exposure, and it's just blank. It's nothing. So the way I went around that with my ISO, I had to bump it up to auto a few times, and it brought up around the 2500 mark. So then I kept it at 2500, and then I kept it at a 30-second exposure, and I played with all the different exposure types, and eventually that got me some photos looking like this, where I actually got some stars in the shot. So the key was it just wasn't a long enough exposure time with the ISO unless I had to bump it up. And then I figured something else out. My camera actually has a bulb mode, which I never knew, And what bulb basically means is that the shutter will stay open for as long as you hold the button down. But the problem with that was I wasn't going to sit there and hold the button, so I connected my phone and did a couple 2-minute long exposures with lower ISO. I mean, you can let it sit there for up to an hour or two, several hours if you wanted, and I got some different exposures out of that. So just kind of playing around with that. But those are the settings I realized I had to change when I went out there. So you probably have to bump up your ISO a little bit and then keep it right around 30 to 20 seconds, I found. Any longer than that, and the stars will actually move, and they'll start moving and streaking across your image, which is cool if that's the look you're going for. But if you don't want them to move, about 20 seconds is your max, and then just keep a good ISO number. So with that being said, let's jump into the editing process and see what we got. All right, so here we are on the Mac. I typically will edit photos on my iPad just for the simplicity if they're simple photos, but for this one I'm going to actually edit on the computer because I want to kind of get full capacity out of it. And I use a program called On1 Photo Raw. It's basically the best alternative to Lightroom that I've found that you don't have to pay monthly for. You pay like $60 one time, and it's a pretty good piece of software. So like I say, otherwise, if you're just using free alternatives, the Photos app on Mac or Snapseed on mobile are also great alternatives. But for this one, I just wanted to use my main photo editing software. So I put these photos on my desktop in a folder called Space Photos. And like I had just mentioned previously, all these first groups of photos did not come out properly because I didn't have enough light in them. I don't want to necessarily say that they're lost, but I'm not expecting to get anything out of them because, I can come in here and then try to expose a little more. Okay, so I got a few stars out of it if I really bump it up, but nothing compared to some of the other photos we got. So we'll go through and take a look at some of these other photos. So we'll scrub over. This is where I started using an ISO. And look at that. That's pretty cool. You can see all the light pollution in the sky. Holy cow. It was so dark out there, but we still had light pollution. Where I'm at, I had pollution from Denver, which was about an hour and a half away, which is crazy. And that's that light pollution that you see. Ridiculous that a city that far away gives you that much light pollution. But it's very blurry. And this is something I noticed because I did look at these a little bit. Very blurry. So what I had decided I needed to do was set my focus to manual because it was so dark. I wasn't thinking. I had my camera on autofocus. So it just focused as if the stars were super close right in front of the camera and we got them blurred out really far away. So from a distance, it looks neat, but up close, it looks kind of blurry and kind of bad. So I'm going to skip that one. I know I have some other ones in here that were pretty good. That one's also blurry. That manual focus is important. That one's also blurry as it's trying to render as I go through. Also blurry. I believe all of these were a little blurry, which is fine because there's so much light pollution in that anyway. We could edit some of that out, but it's just, I'm not a fan of the blurriness. I believe many of these were blurry, but that's a learning experience. I mean, that's the whole point of going out to do this sort of thing. How do you know that unless you go do it? So manual focus is really important when you're doing this. All right, so this one is the first one that kind of came out clear, and you can see all of these have little lines, and that's what I was talking about. The stars are actually moving while your camera is exposing the shot. So while they are in focus, they actually moved, and that's why it creates that little streak of light. So you can imagine this is how you get photos if you leave your camera exposed for hours. That's how you get all the circle streaks and the stars going around. But right now, it's barely noticeable from a distance. So that's kind of what we ended up with. So let's edit this photo. I think it's a really good start. We can mess around with our exposure a little bit. If we bump it up too much, we start to get a lot of noise in that, and that's from the ISO and just the extra light that was in the photo. And we don't want to see a whole lot of that, but we want to bring out any hidden stars because there's actually a lot in there that we can't see right away. If we bring it down, we can't see any. We'll bring it up just so we can barely see, so before we see that extra light. Contrast, we'll turn the contrast. See, if we go too high of a contrast, we lose a lot of stars in the background. If we go too low, we bring a lot of them up with a lot of extra noise. I'll bring it down just a little bit. The highlights, I'm going to bump up all the way just so that any stars that are appearing are going to be even brighter. The shadows, I'm going to bump up ever so slightly because that'll help to bring out more detail in the little stars. The midtones, And this program is very similar to Adobe Lightroom. You don't have to worry about exactly how I'm editing in this. If you're familiar with Lightroom, great. It's pretty familiar. Otherwise, you can pretty much adjust all these parameters on any editing software that you're on. Midtones, I'm going to bump up just a little bit because I want it to appear nice and black because it's space. We're shooting into space. I want to see some stars against the black of space. Whites will turn up. That'll just help the stars pop out even better, ever so slightly. The blacks we're going to turn down. So this is where the magic comes in. We can kind of really tone that down so we get a really black background of space. And then we can pull up some of our other midtones. See those stars appearing? See those other stars? I mean, we have a little bit of red, that noise going on, but if we pull up our midtones, we can see even more stars showing up. Pull our blacks down ever so slightly, our contrast down just a little bit. I mean, it's just basically these sliders that we're playing with to try to pull those stars, that imagery out of the photo. And as you can see, that looks pretty darn cool. So we'll scroll down to structure here. We'll turn it up just a little bit. I mean, if we turn it way up, then we get all the little detail, and that's a little too much. So we'll turn it down a bit. So it's bumped up just a little bit. We'll turn our haze. We'll turn our haze down because we can kind of see it's really only affecting these larger portions. You know, if we turn it up, it just creates kind of more of that light corona around some of the brighter objects. We'll turn it down a little bit so that everything's a little better defined. Temperature I'm going to leave as is because if I try to turn it blue, you know, we start getting all these weird colors. We want to leave the colors as they were because every star is a different color. You know, there's blue stars, red stars, and you can even see that by looking at them just with your eye, and the camera just captures that. So I'm actually going to bump up the saturation a little bit so we can kind of see the different colors and the variations in the stars. Turn up our vibrance a little bit. And that looks pretty darn good. I'm pretty happy with that. So we'll export this one and save it. All right, well, that's exporting. We'll move on to the next photos. These, I believe, were all the same because these photos were basically identical. I kind of took them back to back from the same spot to try to get some different variety. We started with this, and we ended with that. So there's so much more information that your camera's seeing aside from what you see in the photo. And that's the beauty of a raw photo, like what we're editing in. And this really just pulls out a lot of detail. It's very cool. Here's another blurry one. This was a super long exposure. I believe this one was 2 minutes. It was over 2 minutes long, this exposure, which is cool. But I think if you're going to do a long exposure like that, you got to really commit to it and make it like, 10, 20 minutes so that you really get all the light trails. But you can kind of see how they're starting to fade down a little bit. But from the distance, it just looks blurry. So we got to kind of have that complete light trail option. But it started out, I mean, we could have exposed it longer to do a light trail. Maybe next time that's what I'll do. But you can kind of see how that would look really awesome if we left it go just a little bit longer. We get some really long star trails there. Again, a little blurry. We got to make sure that that focus is set properly manually. This was just kind of the lights out east. So where I was I just pointed this kind of along the road facing east. There's a bunch of windmills out there. If I turn this up, you can really see where I was. I mean, I was in the middle of nowhere. It was dark. Those are all windmills popping up. Those are like houses way out there. And then the stars in the sky. Again, this one was a little blurry. It's difficult to check that at nighttime, but taking the extra second to make sure that you're in focus is really, really important. And it helps. I won't edit this one for the video. I'll edit it off camera because this video is all about space photos, not horizon photos. This one was probably one of my favorites I did. So this, I kind of pointed towards the opposite direction from where I was originally shooting. This was the brightest cluster of stars in the sky. And we actually had some power lines running through that you can see here. And then more light pollution from the city. But again, it was a little out of focus, but I think we can clean it up a little bit and make it look even cooler. So I'm actually going to bump the exposure up just a little bit so we get even more stars. I just love how blue they look. It looks so cool. Turn our contrast down a little bit. Highlights, we're going to turn those down because that helps to diminish that light pollution, which just really hurts your photography. We'll turn that down. I'm not sure if this is going to work well or not. Because, I mean, like, look at that. You can see so many stars and so much detail in that, but we get our light pollution from it. So what if we try to remove the light pollution entirely? I don't know that we can, honestly, unless we underexpose it and remove most of the stars, but we don't want that. So let's just leave this as it is. Let's kind of turn it down a little bit. I mean, light pollution is just a part of the world we live in. I had a spot on my lens. You can see that right there. I'm just going to retouch that, and that's just going to pull information over from another part of the photo, and that kind of fixes that spot a little bit. But I think this looks cool. I mean, aside from the light pollution and the power lines, we could really Photoshop this if we wanted to, but the fact is there's so much detail around these stars that we would really lose a lot of the image if we tried to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roll with it. It's what we got, and we're going to go with it. Try to keep that light pollution at bay as much as we can. Turn up our saturation just a little bit, just a tad. I mean, if we go too much, then it looks fake. Just a tad so we can pull out the blue and the stars. I mean, kind of get the orange glow from the city. But I think that looks pretty cool, actually. I'm going to export that one and save it. Moving on. Again, these are all a little blurry. Something I realized, I believe this one, I zoomed in as far as I possibly could. I was at probably about 150 millimeters on my lens, and I had used a remote shutter for it. But the problem I think happened was the wind. It was so windy, and just a little bit of movement on the tripod causes it to shake, and then we lose focus and it gets blurry. So I think that's what happened with that one. And that's the difficult part when you're taking photos one every minute or so. I was out there for about 45 minutes and I got about 30 photos. And, you know, when half of them are blurry because it was windy or some other reason, it's frustrating. But that's kind of the art, and that's the fun part about seeing them develop. All right, we'll pick one more to edit here real quick. Okay, there we go. So out of about 30 photos, we have 3 of them edited, and that's about an average ratio. When you take 1,000,000 photos, you usually keep about 1 per every 10 photos you take. So we're right on par. So this is the first one that we got. That's the second one that we got. And that's the third one that we got. Just very cool. Very, very cool. If I had to do it differently, and I will go do it again someday, I will obviously set the manual focus to just the right spot every time. And then I'll probably try to keep the exposure a bit longer using that bulb mode. And then I end up getting some star trails with that as well. But in the meantime, I'm pretty happy with how they came out, honestly. For standing outside in the freezing cold for 40 minutes, it wasn't too bad. So you can kind of see Orion in this shot. You can see the stars actually moved on me. I believe this was a minute long exposure, maybe 2 minutes. But you can see all of them were moving up out of the frame, which is just crazy. It's awesome. But you can see Orion's belt right here, the 3 stars. Just very cool. Very, very cool. So I hope you learned something. I hope you get to go try this on your own. Let me know how it goes for you. I want to see what you create. Go create something awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.